Welcome back to the Minecraft animation tutorial series using Blender 4.0. This is the third chapter of this 5-part series, and if you didn't watch the previous episodes, be sure to check them out here or click the link in the description as well. If you watched the previous parts already, well done, and let's continue. With our Minecraft world and character imported into Blender, it's time to add some lighting to make the scene go from this to this. Pretty cool, right? So this is pretty simple to do, it's not as hard as it seems, so let's jump right in. So to add the lighting in Blender, there are two main ways you can do that. There are more ways, but two most common ways are using either the sky texture, which is built inside Blender, or using an HDRI Sky, which basically wraps the sky around the world. So first, let's open up the Blender sky texture and let's do the first method. I'm gonna scroll out so that I can see my world and my sky, and then go inside the material view and then enable these again. So scene lights and then scene world, let's enable them. So if I click here, which is the world properties, I see this menu where we have like surface, color, and strength. We want to use this color for now, so we should use this button over here. So if I click this, I'm gonna have different options right here. Underneath texture, go down and then choose sky texture. And as you can see, we have loaded like a sky texture, our scene got a lot brighter, and we have some lighting in the scene. Now, the sky texture comes with the sun automatically. So what we can do is, we can play around with these different settings. The main things we can do is adjust the strength. So if I turn this up, I'm gonna have like a stronger sun, but this is obviously too much. So you can keep it at 1, or you can turn this up at like 2 or 3. But I recommend to keep this at 1, so that it's not like too bright and it gives our scene some lighting. Over here we have different settings that we can play around with. So on the material view, it's pretty hard to see the shadows. So let's go inside the rendered view. And as you can see, we have some shadows over here. There are shadows of like grass, the trees, and even our character. What we can do is play around with the sun's parameters. If I change the sun rotation, as you can see, the shadows are changing the direction. And now my sun is shining from here, and then I have my shadows casted over here. So if I want the sun to be shining like right in front of the character, what I can do is change the rotation again. So I can click and hold this and drag it up. And then I have my shadows like right behind the character. And at the moment, it's like the only way to preview this, because if we switch to EV or if we switch to material view, it's like pretty hard to see the shadows. So let's go back to cycles. And another thing you can do is go to the render properties again, click on sampling, and then you can turn on the viewport denoiser. And it's basically going to show you the viewport in a much cleaner way. And you can turn up the samples to something like 10. And then you will be able to see a viewport in like much cleaner way. It's going to take longer to load, but this is the sacrifice basically. So this is the sky texture. This is the sky texture method. Again, go to the world properties, play around with sun rotation. I'm actually going to move this like somewhere here so that our character's face is lit up and then the shadow is behind the character. You can keep the sky texture, but let me show you another way. Another way to change the sky and basically import a lighting is, let's Control Z multiple times. Let's say we're in a default view. So let's Control Z multiple times until we imported the sky texture. So we're back in this dark world with no lighting. Again, if I click on color and underneath texture, I choose environment texture instead of the sky texture. So if I choose environment texture, everything turns pink, but don't worry about that. What we need to do is click on open, and then we want to locate our HDRI Sky. So let's talk about the HDRI Skies. I'm going to leave some HDRI Skies in the description, but let me explain what those are. HDRI stands for High Dynamic Range Image. So HDRI Skies are basically very high resolution sky images, basically like 8K or above. So you can find very good HDRI Skies on websites like Polyhaven. If I scroll down, I can have like multiple HDRI Skies. I recommend finding skies which have like visible skies and not like everything covering them, like this is covered by trees, for example. But you can find clean skies like this, and then you can download them. And once you download them, you can organize them in your Minecraft animations folder and the HDRI Skies folder. I already have some HDRI Skies downloaded here. As you can see, we have like this reddish color, bluish color, and then night skies. And I'm gonna leave the link to those download links in the description, but you can download your own HDR skies as well. So let's go back in Blender, let's click on open, and let's locate our skies. So go inside the Minecraft animations folder, go inside HDR skies, and then we can load the skies from here, but we cannot see the previews, we only see the names. So if I click on this, I'm gonna be able to see the thumbnails of the sky. If I import like bluish sky, I'm gonna get this like morning feeling. If I import this, I'm gonna go for like moody afternoon lighting. And if I import this, I'm gonna go for like night lighting. For example, if I want to go with like morning bluish sky, I can double click on this. And as you can see, we imported our sky. And if I do shift and middle mouse, I go up and then I rotate around the scene. I have just imported the HDR sky, but the scene still looks pretty dark. So if I go back inside the world, I have the strength value over here. If I drag this up, as you can see, the sky gets a lot brighter. Let's choose something like 7.5. If I go inside the rendered view, I'm going to see a better view of this. It's going to be closer to the final view. So yeah, we have our sky. Basically, this is how we import an HDR sky. You can also customize it, and I'm going to show you how. But when we imported the sky texture, it came with the sun, but the HDR sky doesn't come with the sun lighting, and we don't have any shadows, but we can do that manually. If I move my cursor somewhere over here, like shift and right click, I can click on shift A. If you remember, shift A is basically creating new objects, and I can click on light and then click on sun, or I can search here and then type sun. If I click on sun lamp, I just imported sun lamp into Blender. So let's move this up so that we can see it better. So I just press on G and then move it up. The location of the sun doesn't matter. So if I put this here or here, it doesn't change anything. The main thing is the rotation. So if I click on R and then move this line forward, as you can see, the shadow of this tree is moving. So if I move this forward, I'm going to get the shadows like right behind the character and behind this tree, and my character's face is going to be lit up. If I go to rendered view, I can see the shadows way better. So let's click on this. And as you can see, we have some lighting and we have some shadows as well. Now, if I click on this properties, so this property only appears once we have the sun selected. If I select the tree, it's going to disappear. So if I select the sun and come down to this property, I can play around with these settings. If I increase my sun strength, let's go back to the rendered. If I set the strength to something like 5, as you can see, I have a lot brighter scene, and I can even change the color of the sun. If I want like a morning blue light, I can choose this as if it's like a small moonlight. I can make this a bit blue, but don't go too crazy with it because it's going to look unrealistic. If I want like an afternoon light, I can go for like light yellow, orangey light, and it's going to give the scene like a light orange light. But for now, I'm going to choose like this light blue option, and I'm going to give the scene like a light blue morning feeling. And you can keep these options the same, and you can keep the angle the same because this is supposed to be the same as the sun's actual real life size. And when we import the sky texture, we had the sun size the same as this angle over here. So don't change the settings for now. Keep the cast shadow, keep this, and you can play around with the setting. You can make this like dark, you can make this like brighter, and you can go with any setting you want. Now, the way you customize an HDR sky is pretty easy. So for that, we're going to need to split our screen and go into the different view. So let's keep this like bright. No, let's turn this down to like 5. And then let's keep the strength to like 7.5 of the world. So what you can do is, if you come up here on this edge, and if you click on this edge, we get these 2 arrows. And then if I right click, I'm going to get these 2 options. For now, I need vertical split. And if I press on vertical split, I'm going to get this line. I'm going to move this line somewhere over here. And then if I left click, I will be able to split my screen. So I have different views over here. I'm going to change this view from 3D viewport to this. So click here and then come down to shader editor. If I click on shader editor, we get this new window over here. Let's move into our viewport and let's place our views somewhere over here where we see our sky like nicely. Now let's scroll out and let's check our sky. So basically once you're in the shader editor, you want to click on N, and then right here, we're in the object section. What we need to do is click on object and then go to world. And we have different nodes. So these things right here are called nodes, and nodes work from left to right. Don't worry if you don't know what those are. We're not going to go into like advanced node stuff. We're going to be using like basic nodes and basic node setups. So if you remember, we changed the strength over here, and this is basically the same as this. So if I turn this up, it's going to be changing over here as well. So basically the nodes are the settings which are provided here as well. But using nodes are more versatile, and you can see them better and you can customize them better. So what we want to do now is click on this image texture. This is basically the image we just imported. So if I left click on this node, and if I actually hold and drag, I can move this around. So if I left click, if you remember, in the first chapter of the series, we enabled the Node Wrangler add-on. If you haven't done that, then go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and then search for Node Wrangler. And then enable the Node Wrangler if you haven't. So once we have our Node Wrangler enabled, what we can do is click here and then click on Control T. Once you click on Control T, you get these two new nodes, which are texture coordinates and mapping. We're going to use mapping to change the sky's location. So for example, if I want my sun, which is right here, if I want my sun to be right behind the character, I can use the rotation parameters. So in the mapping node, we have location, rotation, and scale. So we need to use the Z rotation to move the sky. So if I click and drag this, you can see that I'm rotating my sky, and then I want my sun to be somewhere over here, and then I can place it over here. Don't play around with like location, because you're gonna get like crazy results. Don't play with like scale. The main thing you need to play around is the Z location. So adjust the Z location to your willing, and let's place it somewhere here. But since our sun is shining from here, and since our sun is casting shadow from here, it makes sense to move the sun over here. So let's move it right over here. It might not be noticeable in the animation if you have like a sun here and then the sky sun over here, but still, if you want to keep it realistic, then you can move it over here. And this is how you import like HDR skies and how to customize your scene, how to light your scene. And if you want to get rid of this panel, what you can do is go to this edge where we get the two arrows again, right click, then click on join areas. And then here you're gonna have like these options. You're gonna want the arrow to be facing on the left side, and then left click, and then you're gonna be able to get rid of this panel. So we have imported our sky, we have our sun, and now we're ready to basically do the first render and composite our scene. So basically you can keep this HDR method and you can keep this HDR sky, or you can use the sky texture if you liked it more. So we imported the sky with like sky texture with the built-in sun, and we imported the HDR sky and we adjusted it manually, and we added some shadows as well. You can use any method you want, both methods work really well. So I'm going to click on my character, click on F to zoom in again. And what we want to do is basically move our camera in front of our character, and we will be able to start like basic compositing and do the basic lighting. Now I want to move my character slightly over here. You can use like GX, GY. So first thing we need to do is place the camera in front of our character, and the second thing we need to do is render the image. So where is our camera? Can you guess? Well, we don't have to know where the camera is, because we can go inside the outliner and search for camera. Left click on the camera, and we can like shift and right click, move our cursor here. So since we have our camera selected in the 3D viewport and in the outliner and in the viewport as well, I can click on Shift S, apologies, and then selection to cursor. And I just moved my camera over here. I can press G and grab it here, and then if I press on numpad 0, I'm gonna be able to enter inside the camera view. So if you remember, if I press on Shift F, I'm gonna enable the fly mode. And also, when you're in the camera view, you can use your scroll wheel to go in and out. And I recommend to go somewhere over here where you see all the edges of the camera. And let's do Shift F and place the camera like in front of the character, where we will be able to see the character and the background as well. Now I can turn this off. And also, since we're on the topic of like the outliner, as you saw, I searched for the camera. I used the selections cursor method, but you can also just look through these collections, click on camera and find the camera. But searching it is a lot faster once you have like multiple collections enabled here. Let's use Shift F to like place the camera properly. And now since we are here, let's talk about the camera settings and camera properties. So the way you select the camera inside the camera view is you click on this outline. So if I left click and then go out, as you can see, I have my camera selected. So let's have our camera selected. And once we have it selected, we have this property popping up. So if I click on this, these are the camera properties. Right here, we have focal length, which we can change. Basically, in focal length, if you turn this down, if you turn the values down, you're going to get like a wider scene with more depth. And if you turn this up, you're going to get more like flat 2D look. It's not going to be 2D, but it's going to be like flat compared to the lower focal length. So obviously this is like way too much. So we want to find a sweet spot. Like Blender's default, I believe, is like 50. But for the scene, we want to turn it down a little bit, maybe somewhere like 45. Yeah, that looks pretty decent. Again, I think you can use Shift F, move it around and move up and down. Now let's talk about other camera options as well. Right here, we have the viewport display. So if I extend the viewport display, I can see that we have different options. So the main option you want to use while working on animations, that's my recommendation. You can skip this part as well. But if you see, we have this passive part out. We have pass part out. And if we turn this option all the way up, we're going to get dark edges around and we're only going to see what's inside the camera. And this is useful while animating because you're going to be animating everything like inside the camera. You're not going to have everything outside. If you have this all the way down, you might get confused. You might be thinking that you have a character inside the camera, but it's actually here. So if you turn this all the way up, it's pretty easy and it gives you a lot of helping hand. And another thing we need to know is the depth of field, but we're going to enable that towards like the final chapters. It's not necessary to enable it so far, but depth of field is basically like a focus. It basically allows you to focus on the character and blur out the background and give it more like realism and so on. But for now, let's leave it off. Turn up this if you want to improve your workflow. And again, inside the viewport display, if I go to composition guides and if I extend this, I have the option to check like the third center diagonal, but the main thing you want to check, that's not required, but it's recommended. If you left click and select, thirds, as you can see, we have these guiding lines, and these lines are basically telling us the rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds is one of the most famous and most important composition guides. Basically, you want to have your subjects and objects on these lines. So on the left line, if I have my Minecraft character, for example, aligned here, somewhere over here, that can be considered like a good composition. Obviously, that's not the only thing helping a good composition, but it's one of the ways. I don't want to get too technical in this series. It's like a beginner tutorial. So if you want to find out more about rule of thirds, I'm going to leave a link to the Blender Guru's video where he talks about composition. I highly recommend to check that out. Obviously, I can keep my character centered as well. If it's too complicated, you can just turn it off and then just place the camera wherever you want. I'm just gonna have this turn on. But for the animation, I want my character to be the main focus. So I'm gonna rotate the camera and then make my character like in the center of the camera. Basically in the center of the attention. Let's keep our camera this way. Now, once we have our camera placed in front of the character and once we have these options turned off, what we can do is render the image. Rendering the image is basically like taking a picture of what's inside the scene, and it's going to remove all the excess. Like we don't need to see the bones in the final render, we don't need to see the outlines. So if I press on render and then render image, it's going to start rendering the image. But the shortcut for this is F12. So let's click on F12. And then you can see that my image starts rendering. It's going to show me how much time it takes. It's going to show me how much time is remaining. It's going to show me which frame it's on and so on. And it's counting up the samples. If you remember, we left it at 20 samples and now it's at sample 17 and now it's finished rendering. For me, this basic scene took like 16 seconds. For you, it might be longer or shorter depending on your computer speed. Now, we rendered our image. We have a sky background and so on. But as you can see, we have a problem here. Our grass looks horrible. Some of the grass in the background is like not visible. So what we can do is, if we want to go out of the rendered view, I can press on F11 and F11 to go back, or I can just press on escape. I want to select my grass because as we saw when we rendered the image, and this is how the final render will look so far, by the way. So we don't want this to look like this in the final render. So if I click on grass, what we can do is, if we go inside render, and if we go inside light paths, we can turn up the transparent. So it's at 8 right now, but if I type something like 16, and by the way, I want to render the image again, and I want to compare it to the previous image. So what I can do is basically don't render the image yet. Click on F11, and then if you go up here, you can see that we have slots. We have 8 slots in total. We rendered our image in slot 1. But I want to render another image and compare to this image. So if I click on slot 2 and I click on F12, I can render a new image. This took about 15.64 seconds. Now, if I go back to the previous slot, before we had like our transparency low, as you can see, we had these issues with the grass. But if I go into slot 2, as you can see, the issue is now fixed and our grass looks a lot better. Now, if you want to compare slots like quickly, you can use shortcuts, which are basically the numbers on your keyboard. So if I press on 1, I go on slot 1. If I press on 2, I go on slot 2. And 3, 4, and so on. You can compare 8 slots in total. So let's go back to slot 2. As you can see, we fixed the issue with the shadows. Now, since this is a beginner tutorial, I won't show you too much stuff in terms of lighting. We want to keep the things basic and vanilla, but we can still add a few effects. So let's click on escape to go back to the 3D view. And what you can do is, if you want to add some effects to your scene, you can go to Compositing. In part 1, I showed you that we're going to be using this tab in the future. So click on Compositing, and then you're going to be greeted with this new area. So this is the compositor over here. What you need to do is enable use nodes. And if you remember nodes, these are basically working from left to right, and then we can use them to enhance our scene. So just click on this composite node and move it like on the right so that we have our space here. So if I press on Control Shift and then left click on my render layers node, I'm gonna get the viewer node. Let's move the viewer node somewhere over here. And then what viewer nodes is basically, we're gonna be able to see the changes we make here to our image. So if I want to zoom in and out on this background image, I cannot do that because if I use my scroll wheel, it's gonna be zooming in and out on the nodes. So if I press on V multiple times, it's going to zoom out of the image. If I press on Alt V, it's going to zoom in. So let's press on V and I keep it somewhere over here. Also, I can go to View and then zoom in with this slider manually so I can drag it up or down. But what I can do is click on Fit, and this is going to basically show me the whole image, not zoomed in and not zoomed out. Also, I can use this Move tool to click here. And if I click and release my mouse and drag around, I can basically move the image. But let's click on like Fit so that we will be able to see the whole image. Now, there are multiple effects you can do in the compositor, but for this, we're going to be using only one. Let's click on Shift A and search for glare. And then left click to create a node. Now, what you need to do is drag this node somewhere in between those two nodes. So between render layers and between composite. As you can see, if I move this node down, this line becomes a lot brighter. So when this line becomes brighter, once we're here, just do left click to release the node. And then I just dropped my node here, but I cannot see any changes because our viewer node is connected to the render layers node. So once again, if I click on Control, Shift, and then left click on the glare node, I can be able to see the changes made by the glare node. And as you can see, it made our eyes a lot brighter. But this is set to the streaks, and the streaks are basically like star glow. We can add like star glow to different things, but it's not suitable for this moment and for Minecraft. So what I can do basically is change this from streaks to fog glow. And then I can play around with the threshold. So if I turn down the threshold, the glare is going to be stronger and every bright part in the scene is going to become a lot brighter. Like the eyes are going to become brighter. The bright images like the sky and the grass is going to become brighter. And if I turn it all the way down, you can see the scene becomes like a lot brighter. But We want to keep this somewhere over like 0.5 probably, so that it's not too bright, or we can even turn this down even more. Let's try this as well. So yeah, we can do that. And another thing we can do is we can leave the composite nodes over here. You can add more nodes and more effects, and you can check more tutorials, but for this one, we want to keep this simple since this is a beginner tutorial. So let's keep our glare node at like 0.3 or 0.4. And then what we can do as well, if you want to enhance our image, go to the render layers and then scroll all the way down. And then you should see the color management over here. If we go down, we should see that we have AGX and RGB. If you're using an older version of Blender like 3.5 or 2.8, then you should be able to see Filmic here. But after Blender 4.0's release, the main color management system is basically AGX, which makes things look like more realistic. So if you're using like older versions and you're using Filmic, that's fine as well for Minecraft animations. But we're going to be using AGX. But under color management and under AGX, we have look. So right now the look is set to none. But if I click and go down and choose something like medium high contrast. So if I click medium high contrast, as you can see, it's going to give me a lot more contrast in the scene. It's going to have like more depth to the scene. And I can go even higher. I can choose like very high contrast. And as you can see, the scene is becoming more high contrasty. So what we can do is keep this at 0.7. And then we can choose something like medium high contrast. And as you can see from here, you want to like play around with the settings. There's like no perfect setting. You can follow along exactly what I'm doing, but you can give it your own twist and you can give it like your own effects. And you can play around with like exposure as well. So if you click and drag exposure down, as you can see, my scene becomes a lot darker. If I move it up, it's going to become brighter and less contrasty. So let's turn this down a little bit, not too much. We want to keep our glare and effects, and we can have our scene like this. Let's turn on the threshold again, so like 0.5. Let's see how it looks. Maybe like 0.6 or 0.7. Yeah, let's keep it at 0.7. And yeah, we have this pretty vanilla looking scene. And we can keep this glare, we can keep this to medium high contrast, and you can play around with different settings as well. Another cool thing which you can do in Blender is a real-time compositor. So right here we have this dope sheet which we will be using in the future for animations, but let's change this to 3D view. So click here and then change this to 3D viewport. And then as you can see, we're viewing everything from the top. So if I press on numpad 0, I'm gonna go inside the camera view. I can scroll in and out, as you remember. And what I can do here is turn off the overlays. So if you don't want to see any bones or any camera lines, I can click on this button, which is called show overlays. And if I disable this, all the overlays are going to disappear. And then I can click on material preview, or actually let's click on rendered preview because we want to view the changes made in the compositor. Basically what we did previously is we first rendered the whole image and then we checked the compositing changes using the viewer node. But in the new Blender updates, we can basically see these changes in real time. So let's go out of the camera view and let's place my camera somewhere over here. No, not my camera, but let's place our view somewhere over here. And then if I come down here and I change this to always, what this means is that compositor right now is disabled. But if I choose this to always, I'm going to be able to see the changes made in the compositor to the viewport in real time. So if I turn the threshold all the way down, as you can see, the scene becomes a lot brighter here and then here as well. If I go inside the camera, I can basically view these changes over here as well. But obviously we don't want the threshold that low. So let's keep it at 0.7. So yeah, this is another cool way to preview basically everything in like real time. Obviously this is not as accurate as this. I still recommend to render your image and check the nodes and check everything with the viewer node. But if you want to quickly view everything without rendering your image in real time, you can do that as well by basically going to rendered view and then checking this to always. Now let's go back to solid view here and let's go back to the layout. So here's one thing I want to mention as well. While you're working on animations and you're making the lighting and setting up your scene, you might find out that you like some changes more than the other changes. So for example, I showed you how to import HDRI skies, how to set up the sky manually, but I first showed you the method of importing the sky texture along with like built-in sun. So I think for this tutorial, I want to keep this sky texture. So you can follow along or you can keep this HDRI sky you imported. But what we can do is we can go into the world properties, and basically we can just delete this whole world, and it's going to turn everything into like dark sea. And what I can do is also go back to solid view, select my sun, and then delete that as well because we won't need it. So go back to the rendered view, and then you can click on new, and then do the same thing we did in the first method. So click here and then choose sky texture, and then rotate the sun so that it's like back to the character. So sun rotation, increase it until we have the shadows like behind the character. And if I click on my camera, and if I click on F11, I can go inside slot 3. So left click on the image and then click on 3 on your keyboard. And then let's render the image again. Now obviously the scene is a lot brighter than we need. So first thing we can do is turn the threshold to 1. Then go to layout. And then let's play around with these settings as well. So let's turn down the sound strength to something like 0.3 or 0.2 as well. And then go back to the render layers or the render properties, scroll down, go inside the color management again, and set this to something like medium contrast or base contrast. Now let's render the image again. And as you can see, we have this like cinematic lighting with a lot of shadows. Obviously the glare is still a bit too much, so we can go to compositing, turn it up even more, and we get this look. Also, you can play around with the contrast look again. You can play around with the exposure. Let's set it back to 0. I played around with these settings, and I think this punchy settings fits really well with the scene. You can zoom in and out. Also, you want to play around with these settings. You don't want to settle down for like one setting. Go to the world view. Obviously, you can still play around with strength. You can play around with the sound's rotation. And what you can do is, another thing I forgot to show you, is you can play around with the sun elevation. So, if I move this up, this is going to give me like this bright afternoon light. But if I move this down, this is going to give me more like a night sky feeling. So everything turns all the way dark. So this is a very, very good way if you want to change the time of the day. If you want to do like a time-lapse animation, you can do that as well. And as you can see, we're into this like evening lighting with not much shadows. But let's turn this up until we get this like bright afternoon lighting. And then let's try to render the scene again. Let's go to F11, go into slot 4, and then render with F12. And I think the sun is a lot brighter, so I'm going to turn down the sun elevation, and I'm going to turn on the strength as well, all the way to like 0.1, maybe to 0.2, and then I'm going to re-render this. So yeah, this is the scene we get. This is like the bright, moody afternoon lighting. If we go to slot 1, this is what we got from HDRI lighting, and we fixed these, but I overwrote it on the slot 2, so we don't see the other changes here. So you can keep the HDR lighting, which basically looks like this, and you can keep this cinematic lighting, which looks like this. It's up to you. I'm going to keep the sky texture over here. So let's keep this lighting so you can play around with these settings. But I recommend don't play around like too much, because you might get like too picky, go too much into detail. After all, this is like the animation tutorial, so we just want to get our scene prepared to do some animation. And you can keep the lighting basic for now. And if you want me to do like advanced lighting tutorials, be sure to leave the comment down below. But for this one, let's keep this lighting, let's render the scene, and let's see how it looks. So we can keep this look for now. It looks pretty neat, pretty vanilla, and we can continue after part 4. So this concludes part 3 of the series, where we covered the basics of lighting, compositing, where I showed you how to change the contrast. I showed you how to import HDRI skies and the sky texture, and this gets us ready to jump into part 4, where we will be doing animation, and I'm going to explain the animation basics, and we're going to create this cool short animation and make our character do some cool motions. Also, be sure to check out my Patreon if you want to support the channel and get cool rewards as well. Now, part 4 should appear on the screen, so click here and I'll see you in part 4.